So tonight we're going to continue our journey through Pluto by house. Just kind of a reminder that like it's very theoretical and we're still kind of nuts and boltsing it. And so, you know, once we start adding in charts, then I think that things will start to connect. But part of why I do this is because, well, it's important, but also because you're learning to think psychologically about things, right? This is about people's inner worlds. It's about shadow stuff. It's about things that like are not necessarily like up and conscious for them, right? So we are really leaning into like what's going on in the undercurrents, what's going on in terms of repressed energies about a person. And they're just snapshots. And one of the reasons for that is time, but it's also because as we go through the nodes, through the houses and signs, you're going to see some echoes, and that'll just allow us to get some more repetition in there and to go a little bit deeper. And then when we start bringing charts in, or when we get to the Q&A, which the first one's in like 2 weeks, I think, then you can bring in chart examples and you'll start to see how these things are at work. But because we're talking about psychology, it's important to like, and I repeat this all the time, contemplation is such an important tool for astrological learning, because you'll get a concept and you'll be like, oh, well, this is what I think about that concept, right? Like if I say, you know, the third house polarity point is about conversation, and then you might like have an image come to mind that's like two people conversing with each other. That would make sense. But like, what else could it look like? What is at the root of conversation? It's people exchanging ideas, right? And then it also has to do with listening to each other. And so then it has to do with like the ear mechanics of listening, but it also has to do with like heart listening, right? Or like, and so you can take it off into all these different areas. And as you learn to think about how to expand concepts into practical advice, practical form, that's where astrology gets really effective, right? And that's a lot of what module 3 we'll talk about too. Okay, so tools that'll help you really get EA: study psychology, particularly good psychology, like I said last week, like depth psychology, transpersonal psychology, somatic therapies, anything that's linking the body with the emotions with the mind. And, you know, not just looking at brain chemistry or not just looking at cognitive function. What was the other thing that just came to my mind? And then looking at charts, right? Looking at charts alongside a public figure's biography, looking at charts of people you know. Okay, all right, cool. So this week, in our attempt to cover Pluto through houses 4 through 12, just the refresher that I'll give every week, the method that we're working with is looking at the undercurrents or the patterns in terms of Pluto, the south node of the moon, and the ruler of the south node of the moon, as well as aspects to them. And the Trinity of the Future, which is the polarity point, north node of the moon, and the ruler of the north node of the moon. Ding. And so again, reviewing, what is Pluto? Deep current of the soul, right? So core tendencies, patterns, and responses, the deepest shit, if you will. Emotional and psychological wounding, the style through which our compulsions come through, our deepest unconscious security needs. So that's just another way of saying like the patterns we go to instantly when we're in, you know, fight, flight, or freeze, or when we're trying to feel more secure, especially emotionally secure, sometimes physically secure. So our central evolutionary concerns, a la Pluto describes what your soul has been learning about, and the polarity point describes what your soul is trying to lean into. Pluto describes the path of least resistance, right? So those patterns we default to under stress, events of high intensity, what we've been learning about, and distortions, which is why, you know, I've said before, and I'll say it again, Pluto in your chart can also be like things that you're really good at, but that's not what we're focusing on right now. Okay, we're focusing on the shadow, we're focusing on the negative. That's not because there's all there is. It's not because I'm a masochist or sadist, right? It's just because that's what people are looking at when we go to EA. All right. I feel like we've already talked about that. Okay. So what we've covered in terms of kind of like very quick pop psychology so far has been complexes and trauma. We talked about those in the intro video, the 2-hour intro video that you have hopefully watched. Those are very important themes. Last week, we talked about attraction repulsion, and we talked about shadow. And a lot of these psychological themes are, again, what we'll be going more in depth into them in module 3 when we get into like practitioner space and, you know, how to be with people when you're working with this kind of material. But I like to just kind of like pull them in right now because I'll often use these words. And so it's nice to at least have a little definition. So this week we have the unconscious. What is the unconscious? The aspect of reality that's not available to consciousness. Okay. So I think that like we're probably all familiar with that idea that like not every part of you is conscious to you. You know, last week I used the example of if somebody, you know, is abused as a child, they might not have memories of it, like memories of what happened, but they still have emotions that come up that are related to it, or they might have fears or phobias that come up that are related to it, right? So the actual memory of the event is stored away in the unconscious. All right. We also talked about this last week in terms of shadow, right? The parts of ourselves that we reject, whether they're positive or negative, and just repress, go into the unconscious. So we can break it down a little bit farther. We have the personal unconscious, which we can think of as below the surface of the mind, right? It's comprised of the things we've repressed, sexual fantasies, taboo things, although it can be positive as well. And then we have the collective unconscious, right? Which is more what we talk about when we think of like Neptune. And so one of the things that one of the models that I think is really helpful for understanding this, and you might have seen it before, but it's an iceberg model, right? So the tip of the iceberg is what's above the water, and that's kind of like the personal unconscious. You can see it, you know it's there, right? And then as it goes below the water, it's still kind of like visible. The iceberg is still kind of visible from above, right? You can kind of see hints of it. But it's sometimes very alarming at how much bigger it is than the tip of the iceberg, right? And then the collective unconscious is more like the ocean beneath the iceberg. And that's kind of the repository or the, you know, space where the memories of all things exist, all things human, maybe. I don't know if it includes, you know, all the events of all sentient beings. I can't know that. But you'll also hear it, you know, referred to as like, I think the Akashic field would be something similar, right? And in metaphysical speak. And so the collective unconscious is where the archetypes live, right? These primal energies that kind of like get stimulated and are really universal, but then kind of funnel up into our own personal experience, our own personal bodies, and we have our own relationship with the archetypes, right? The archetypal mother or the fool or the trickster or you know, the priestess, or there's so many of them. The tarot does a really good job of exploring archetypes as well. But the planetary archetypal energies are there too. Zodiacal energies. And so when we're talking about something that's unconscious at that level of Pluto, we're usually talking about personal unconscious, right? But personal unconscious is interwoven with collective events. And this is part of why the outer planets are so interesting, because they really bring in the dance that we all have between what happens in our personal lives and what's happening at the collective level or the historic level, right? We find ourselves swept away by the tides of history. And so the outer planets kind of represent that awakening of how connected we all are. Okay, any questions about that? Okay. Oh, hold on, let me get my honey tea all situated here. I remembered this week. All right. All right, so Pluto in the 4th house or Cancer. And this is really where we start to get into, you know, we actually have Pluto in Cancers alive right now. All right. So Pluto in Cancer, Leo, Virgo, Libra, Scorpio, Sagittarius, Capricorn. All of these souls are populating the earth right now. And so as I've been putting this together, you know, in this, this is the 3rd or 4th round of me teaching this class. What's really kind of crystallized in my mind is that when it comes to Pluto, the conflation is real, right? So like you could learn about your Pluto house and your Pluto sign and you get a lot of information, right? With the sign being the generational signature. And for those of you who are a little bit newer, what that means is that the orbit of Pluto is very slow. And so Pluto spends a large amount of time in a sign. And so a lot of people, like anybody born 73 to 85-ish has Pluto in Libra, right? So it's not as personal. What makes it personal is the house placement. So the sign is a generational signature, the house placement is personal. Where I was originally going with this thought is that Pluto Pluto in particular, they're very similar, right? That gets into that conflation thing, right? Like signs and houses are different, but we're talking about the deep psychological signatures represented by Pluto. House and sign, not so much of a difference. It'll come through a little bit in nuance or when you hear people's stories. When we get into the nodes, there's going to be more of an explicit difference. Okay, and I will break down the nodes in that context. Hopefully that makes sense. Hopefully any of my words are making sense. Okay, so Pluto in Cancer for the 4th house. And so, you know, on the bright side, on the positive side, a lot of these folks are born with a really deep understanding of what it means to be family, what it means to have a deep connection to roots. They just kind of have an instinctive understanding of that, which, you know, can be a really good thing in our society. It can also be a really painful thing, right? Like if you have a deep instinctive knowing of and need for like bonded familial relationships, not to say we don't all, we exist in a time where there are a lot of heavy quotes dysfunctional families, right? And I don't know if that's just a modern conception. I can't get into the philosophy of that. But these folks are just like inherently geared towards strong family bonds or bonds that feel like blood. What does that mean? I have your back no matter what, right? Like there's a container here for you. You will be, I know how to hold space for you. So with like Gemini 3rd house energy, which came before, the soul had been projecting themselves out into the world in order to kind of like collect data, right? Collect info and facts. And so there was lots of emphasis on mind and intellect. And so then we know that the 4th house archetype is going to be more inward again, right? Because it goes inward to outward, back and forth. And there's a kind of like a limit to what the mind can access. And so we need to go in again to reunite with emotional reality, right? And so Cancer 4th house souls have been learning about the core truth that evolution can only happen through the emotional body. Now, is this an inherent truth? No, you'll find lots of systems that will say evolution can only happen through the mind. But what this is based in is this idea that like you can have mental ahas, right? Like you might have a couple tonight during this lecture where you hear something about your Pluto placement. You're like, oh, right? But those ahas don't move energy. And what we're talking about when we're talking about like trauma that survives from lifetime to lifetime, or our deepest patterns, is largely unconscious material around unresolved things or stuck energy. And what moves stuck energy is emotional and physical catharsis, not mental catharsis, emotional and physical, right? And so that's why you'll hear a lot of evolutionary astrologers say evolution happens through the emotional body. It happens through those moments of like movement, of crying, of laughing, of running, of pushing. That's how energy moves. So the Cancer archetype is where the soul feels everything, right? Cancer and the other water signs, but especially Cancer, is associated with emotional overwhelm. And if you think about it in reference to its opposite sign, Capricorn and its ruler Saturn are about repression, right? So they work synergistically together. The emotional overwhelm happens, the Capricorn function puts a lid on it, essentially, right? Gives it a container, gives it boundaries, right? And so fourth house folks have been learning lessons of emotional security. We'll just kind of like put a peg in what I was saying about the emotional overwhelm. They've been learning about emotional security, and the process of trying to obtain emotional security from external sources. So oftentimes these folks are born into a situation where one or both parents are not available to support this. Okay, not to support the need for like emotional containment, space holding. Like this image says that, you know, what a parent would do, ideally speaking, I think in my world, is like answer yes to all these questions and provide the behaviors that back it up. Am I good? Am I loved? Am I safe? Because Cancer is our first awareness, as we talked about in the developmental model, of being separate, right? We develop consciousness and logic in Gemini. And then we get to Cancer and it's like, whoa, I'm different, I'm separate, I'm not attached through the umbilical cord, right? And so there is this inherent insecurity in the Cancer archetype. And so for these folks, you know, when I say like one or both parents are not available to provide that, it's not necessarily through malicious intent, right? It can be that like both parents had to work outside the home in order to make money, right? To put food on the table. It can also be describing situations of emotional abuse or physical abuse. With the point being that it's oftentimes situations where the person was in childhood really forced in on themselves to get their emotional needs met, or they just didn't get their emotional needs met, right? So oftentimes fourth house Pluto folks have really complex karma with their current life family members. There can be cycle like that. There can be that feeling of recognition with current life family members, but there can also be like cyclical letting each other down, losing each other. And so there is, again, this kind of sense of constant insecurity that really leaves a mark. Again, emotional insecurity. So this kind of sets up transference dynamics later in life, right? So there's a lot of unmet emotional needs from childhood that then get projected out onto their partners and friends in their future life, sometimes their children as well, right? And so, I mean, I don't know, I'm of the opinion that most folks can benefit from inner child work, but it's usually really, really super important for folks with heavy fourth house signatures, heavy Cancer signatures, the moon involved with Pluto or the nodes, to kind of like do that caretaking that needs to be done, and to identify what the unresolved material is so that it's not getting projected out onto partners. I mean, we all do this, at least in my worldview, we all do this thing where we project our unmet childhood needs onto our partners, essentially to try to get them to perform the role of parent so that we can like close the loop, so that thing can be resolved. It just tends to be underscored in these folks, right? Like it's a primary task of this lifetime. Oftentimes as a child, they can have really intense past life emotional memories come up that can be very dysregulating, not that they know that that's happening. And so there's, excuse me, there can be a really deep fear of being vulnerable at the same time as they can also be overly vulnerable too quickly with people who kind of match the energetics of the parental dynamic, right? Resulting in a feeling of being victimized by the person. Cancer is an archetype that oftentimes has to do with feelings of victimization or experiences of being victimized. Same thing with Pisces, same thing with Scorpio. And so they need a lot of empathetic space holding, and it can be really hard for them to get that. And so, you know, sometimes fourth house Pluto folks do incarnate into like really supportive families that give them what they need to work through this stuff. I would say that I see that occasionally it happens. But another thing that can happen is that they get extremely stuck in the subjective. They get very stuck in their emotional realities. This is true for a fifth house Leo Plutos as well. The subjective reality becomes the only thing that exists, right? And the emotions get very sticky. I am sad and I will be sad forever. I am a sad person. There's that identification with the emotion. So that has to do with what we've been talking about in terms of like the moon being associated with ego identity, right? And so this carries through into the Pluto thing as well. It's not like I'm feeling overwhelmed, it's I'm an overwhelmed person.